The early morning silence at St. Gabriel's Church shattered with gasps and screams. Father Michael Crawford watched in disbelief as the ancient crucifix, which had hung above the altar for over a century, began to move. The massive wooden cross creaked, and the figure of Christ appeared to strain against its nails. As sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting ethereal shadows across the sanctuary, panicked whispers turned to cries of fear and wonder. Some fell to their knees in prayer, while others fled toward the exits. In that moment, none could have foreseen how this inexplicable event would expose the corruption lurking beneath their sacred community. Before we begin this extraordinary tale from St. Gabriel's Church, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like button to join our spiritual journey together. Millbrook, Massachusetts, nestled in the Berkshire foothills, wore its history like a well-worn prayer book. At its heart stood St. Gabriel's Church, a Gothic revival masterpiece whose weathered stone walls had witnessed generations of prayers, marriages, and farewells. The church's towering spire, visible from every corner of the town, served as both a physical and spiritual landmark for the community of 12,000 souls. The town itself was a study in contrasts. Along Maple Street, stately Victorian homes with manicured lawns housed old money families whose names appeared on hospital wings and library cornerstones. Yet just blocks away, in the shadows of abandoned textile mills, working-class families struggled to maintain dignity in aging triple-deckers. The economic divide had grown steadily since the mills closed 20 years ago, leaving a wound that even time seemed reluctant to heal. St. Gabriel stood as a bridge between these two worlds. Its worn wooden pews hosted both designer suits and patchwork clothes each Sunday, though rarely side by side. The church's soup kitchen, running continuously since the Great Depression, served as a stark reminder of ongoing need. Every Wednesday, luxury cars would park alongside rusty pickups as volunteers from both sides of town worked together, though their conversation rarely ventured beyond the task at hand. The church itself had fallen on harder times. Its once pristine walls now showed water stains, and the heating system groaned like a dying beast during winter masses. The stained glass windows, masterpieces from a 19th-century German artisan, desperately needed restoration. A particularly beautiful panel depicting the Annunciation had developed a crack that seemed to grow with each passing season. Father Crawford had maintained a detailed list of needed repairs since his arrival 5 years ago, but the parish building fund remained perpetually insufficient. While wealthy parishioners like Emily Walker made regular donations, much of the church's resources went to supporting its charitable missions, a priority Crawford refused to compromise, despite pressure from certain quarters to scale back these efforts. The parish records, kept in leather-bound volumes in a small room off the sacristy, told the story of a once prosperous congregation. Baptisms and weddings had declined steadily over the past decade, while funerals seemed to fill the church more frequently. The younger generation, those who hadn't left for bigger cities, mostly attended Christmas and Easter services, if at all. Yet despite these challenges, St. Gabriel's retained a fierce loyalty among its core congregation. Every Sunday, elderly Mrs. Sullivan arrived an hour early to arrange altar flowers, using blooms from her own garden to save the church money. Mr. Chin, who owned the local hardware store, regularly appeared unannounced to fix whatever needed mending, refusing payment beyond a cup of coffee and conversation. These acts of devotion, small but significant, spoke to the deeper meaning St. Gabriel's held for its community. The church had stood through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, social upheavals, and countless personal crises. Its bells had rung to celebrate victories and warn of disasters. Its doors had never closed, not even during the darkest days of recent history. Now, as autumn painted the surrounding maple trees in brilliant reds and golds, St. Gabriel's faced perhaps its greatest test. The miracle or event, as some preferred to call it, would shake not just the physical foundation of the old church, but the very bedrock of faith upon which it stood. The coming weeks would reveal how decades of unspoken tensions, hidden corruption, and tested loyalties could threaten to tear apart not just a church but an entire community. Yet none of this was apparent on that crisp October morning as Father Crawford climbed the worn stone steps to prepare for early Mass. The rising sun cast long shadows through the trees, and a light frost crunched beneath his feet. He paused at the top step, as he did every morning, to whisper a prayer before unlocking the heavy wooden doors. In that moment of silence before the day's trials began, he could almost believe that faith alone would be enough to guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Father Michael Crawford, at 43, carried more burdens than his quiet demeanor suggested. His steel-gray eyes and premature silver at his temples hinted at hardships weathered before joining the priesthood at 35. A former defense attorney, he'd left a promising career after a case gone wrong led to an innocent man's conviction, a weight he still carried. His legal background, though rarely mentioned, gave him a unique perspective on justice and truth that would soon be sorely tested. Sarah Bennett, barely 26, served as the church's youth coordinator while pursuing her master's in social work. Orphaned at 12 when a house fire claimed her parents, she'd been raised by the nuns at St. Mary's home. Her unwavering faith, rather than stemming from naivety, grew from having nothing else to cling to during those dark years. Her deep brown eyes held both compassion and determination, while her slight frame belied an inner strength that even she hadn't fully realized. Bishop Thomas Anderson, approaching 70, represented the old guard of the Catholic Church. His 45 years of service had earned him respect throughout the diocese, though his traditionalist views often clashed with modern realities. Tall and austere, with sharp features and calculating eyes, he commanded attention whenever he entered a room. Yet beneath his rigid exterior lay a questioning soul, increasingly troubled by the gap between doctrine and human need. Father James Parker, the assistant bishop at 48, cultivated an image of progressive charm that masked darker ambitions. His perfectly styled hair and designer glasses suggested affluence beyond his station, while his smooth rhetoric drew wealthy patrons to church causes, or rather, to causes he controlled. His network of influence extended far beyond church walls, though few understood the true extent of his machinations. Emily Walker, a widow at 55, maintained her position among Millbrook's elite through careful manipulation of both her late husband's fortune and others' perception. Her designer clothes and impeccable manners masked a desperate fear of losing status, making her particularly susceptible to Parker's influence. Her substantial donations to the church came with invisible strings that were about to pull tight. The church staff included Rachel Martinez, the sharp-eyed parish secretary whose 20 years of service made her virtually invisible to those who plotted in plain sight, and David Cooper, the elderly groundskeeper whose quiet observations would prove invaluable. Among the congregation, Mary Sullivan, a retired teacher, led the prayer group that would become Sarah's strongest supporters, while Thomas Chen's hardware store would serve as an unlikely headquarters for those seeking justice. But perhaps the most complex character in the unfolding drama was the church itself. St. Gabriel stood as both witness and participant, its ancient stones holding secrets that would slowly come to light. The statue of Christ, centered above the main altar, had watched over the congregation for generations, its serene face bearing witness to countless human dramas. None could have predicted how this silent observer would become the catalyst for exposing long-buried truths. These lives, intertwined through faith and circumstance, formed a delicate web that had maintained its balance for years. But as autumn deepened and the miracle approached, unseen tensions would pull at the strands, threatening to unravel not just individual lives but the entire fabric of their shared community. Each person's response to the impending crisis would reveal not just their character but their true understanding of faith, justice, and redemption. As Father Crawford prepared for that fateful morning mass, none of these players fully understood their roles in the drama about to unfold. They stood at the edge of a transformation that would challenge not just their faith but their very understanding of truth and justice. The statue above watched in silence, its shadow stretching across the altar like a portent of changes to come. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through St. Gabriel's stained glass windows in jeweled patterns across the worn wooden pews. Father Crawford had just begun the early morning mass, his voice echoing softly through the hushed sanctuary. The congregation, smaller for this early service, sat scattered throughout the church, Mrs. Sullivan in her usual front pew, Thomas Chen near the back door, and Sarah Bennett to the side where she could watch the children's corner. The first hint that something was different came during the reading of the gospel. A deep, resonant, creaking sound emanated from above the altar, so subtle at first that only Father Crawford, paused mid-sentence, seemed to notice. He glanced up at the massive crucifix, then quickly returned to the scripture, though his voice carried a new tension. The creaking grew louder, impossible to ignore. Heads began to turn, whispers rippled through the small congregation. Sarah Bennett rose halfway from her seat, her eyes fixed on the century-old crucifix. The sound changed, becoming a grinding of metal against wood, and then in a moment that would be recounted countless times in the days to come, the figure of Christ appeared to move. It wasn't a subtle movement. The corpus, nailed firmly to the cross for over 100 years, visibly strained against its bindings. The ancient wood groaned in protest, and small puffs of dust drifted down from the ceiling mounting. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer beads clattered to the floor as she clutched her chest, her whispered "Lord have mercy" clearly audible in the stunned silence. Father Crawford stood frozen at the altar, his prayer book forgotten in his trembling hands. Above him, the massive figure continued its apparent struggle, the movement becoming more pronounced with each passing second. A sharp crack echoed through the church as one of the nails securing the corpus began to pull free. The spell of silence broke. Someone screamed later Rachel Martinez would admit it was her, and the sanctuary erupted into chaos. Several elderly parishioners rushed for the exits, while others fell to their knees in prayer. Thomas Chen moved quickly to help Mrs. Sullivan, who appeared close to fainting. Children began crying, their frightened voices mixing with the increasingly loud groaning from above. Sarah Bennett, however, moved forward instead of back. She walked slowly toward the altar, her face transformed with a look of wonder rather than fear. "Father," she called out to Crawford, her voice steady despite the chaos, "should we pray?" Her question seemed to snap Crawford back to awareness of his duties. "Please," he called out, his voice cutting through the panic, "remain calm. Those who wish to leave may do so. Those who wish to stay, yes, let us pray." The figure above them continued its inexplicable movement, but Crawford's voice, now raised in prayer, provided an anchor for those who remained. Sarah knelt at the altar rail, her clear voice joining his, followed by Mrs. Sullivan's wavering soprano. A dozen others stayed, forming a small island of prayer in the midst of continuing exodus. As the morning sun rose higher, its rays now struck the crucifix directly through the rose window. The movement seemed to intensify. The second nail began to loosen with a sound like distant thunder. Those still present watched in mingled terror and awe as the corpus slowly, inexorably began to pull away from its cross. Father Crawford found himself unable to look away, even as his mind raced through possible explanations: structural failure, an earthquake, some trick of light and shadow. But in his heart, a deeper truth was taking root, one that both thrilled and terrified him. In all his years of faith, he had never expected to witness something that so completely defied rational explanation. The moment stretched, pregnant with possibility and fear, until it was broken by the sharp slam of the vestry door. Father James Parker had arrived, his face a mask of calculated concern as he took in the scene before him. His arrival marked the beginning of a chain of events that would transform not just St. Gabriel's but the entire community of Millbrook. Father Parker's arrival marked a distinct shift in the atmosphere. His voice, smooth as polished marble, cut through the tension. "My friends," he announced, pulling out his phone, "let's approach this rationally. We should evacuate immediately. Clearly, there's a structural issue here." His words, though calm, carried an authority that seemed to leave no room for supernatural interpretation. Father Crawford watched as Parker efficiently took control, directing the remaining parishioners toward the exits while making calls first to the diocesan office, then to local news contacts he seemed suspiciously prepared to reach. Only Sarah Bennett resisted the evacuation, her eyes still fixed on the crucifix with an expression that mingled wonder and certainty. Within the hour, St. Gabriel's parking lot had transformed into an impromptu gathering. News vans arrived with surprising speed, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like modern crosses. Bishop Anderson appeared, his face grave as he conferred with Parker, deliberately keeping Crawford at a distance from their discussions. The police established a perimeter, though their presence seemed more about managing the growing crowd than addressing any real threat. Inside the church, now declared off limits pending a structural inspection, the crucifix had gone still. The morning light continued to stream through the stained glass, illuminating the displaced figure in a kaleidoscope of colors. The silence within contrasted sharply with the growing commotion outside. The crowd developed its own dynamic as the morning progressed. Clear divisions emerged: those who proclaimed a miracle, led by Sarah Bennett's quiet but unwavering testimony, and those who, following Parker's lead, insisted on finding a rational explanation. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer group gathered near the church steps, rosaries in hand, while others clustered around the news vans, eager to share their versions of events. Father Crawford found himself caught in the middle, each group demanding his support for their interpretation. When pressed by reporters, he chose his words carefully. What we witnessed this morning defies easy explanation. While we await a thorough investigation, I believe our focus should be on coming together as a community rather than dividing over interpretations. His measured response satisfied no one. Parker, standing within earshot, smiled thinly. "Always the diplomat, Michael," he said later, his tone carrying a hint of mockery. "But sometimes people need clear direction, not philosophical ambiguity." The statement carried a warning that Crawford couldn't miss. By early afternoon, social media had exploded with shaky video clips and eyewitness accounts. Parker appeared on local news, his carefully crafted statement emphasizing the church's commitment to a thorough and scientific investigation. His words, Crawford noted, managed to simultaneously acknowledge the possibility of a miracle while subtly undermining those who proclaimed it. Sarah Bennett, surrounded by a growing group of supporters, became the unofficial voice of those who believed. Her quiet certainty proved more compelling than Parker's polished rhetoric. "I saw what I saw," she repeated simply when questioned. "And what I saw was not a structural failure." Bishop Anderson, watching the situation unfold, maintained a diplomatic distance. His public statements were non-committal, promising a full investigation while urging patience and prayer. But Crawford caught the bishop's troubled glances toward Parker during their brief interactions, suggesting deeper concerns beneath the surface. As evening approached, the crowd thinned but didn't disperse entirely. Some remained to pray, others to protest the church's closure, and a few simply to witness whatever might happen next. The Crucifix, now hidden behind locked doors, kept its silence, but its morning performance had set in motion events that would expose far more than just the possibility of miracles. Father Crawford, finally alone in his rectory office, stared at the growing stack of messages and missed calls. Among them, he noticed a small note slipped under his door: "Sarah's handwriting, some things must be believed to be seen." The words haunted him as he prepared for what he knew would be a sleepless night. Father Crawford's unwavering dedication to truth and justice, his internal struggle between faith and reason, and his compassion for his congregation truly deserve a like. Yet sadly, he hasn't received one from you. Would you help support his journey with a simple click? The days following the incident brought an undercurrent of tension to St. Gabriel's that seemed to seep into every corner of Millbrook. Father Crawford, reviewing the church's financial records late one evening, noticed discrepancies that sent a chill down his spine. Large donations, particularly those from Emily Walker's charitable foundation, appeared to have been rerouted through a maze of auxiliary accounts, their final destination unclear. Sarah Bennett faced her own trials. Anonymous letters began appearing at her apartment. Their message clear: some miracles are better left unquestioned. She maintained her composure publicly, but Crawford noticed her hands trembling during morning prayers. The youth group she led suddenly found its budget slashed, officially due to emergency reallocation of funds. The church itself remained closed for investigations, but Father Parker had somehow arranged for selective media tours. Each carefully staged visit resulted in news segments that increasingly portrayed the incident as a structural issue, with subtle undertones suggesting that those claiming a miracle were either naive or attention-seeking. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer group, now meeting in her living room, reported strange cars parked outside their homes. Thomas Chin found his hardware store's tax records suddenly under intensive audit. Rachel Martinez, the parish secretary, began documenting everything she witnessed, hiding her notes in a locked drawer with growing concern. The divide in the congregation deepened. Wealthy parishioners led by Emily Walker publicly backed Parker's rational explanation and called for modernizing church administration. Meanwhile, working-class members rallied around Sarah, their faith strengthened rather than shaken by the unexplained event. Crawford's attempts to bridge the gap met with increasing resistance. His homilies, delivered in the parish hall temporarily serving as a chapel, called for unity and understanding. but each sermon seemed to draw sharper lines between the factions. Parker attended these services now, his presence a constant reminder of growing scrutiny. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Late one night, as Crawford sorted through years of financial records, Rachel Martinez appeared at his office door. Her usual professional demeanor cracked as she handed him a USB drive. "I've been keeping copies," she whispered. "Father Parker. He doesn't know I have access to his private email account. What they're planning. It's not just about the miracle anymore." The files revealed a pattern of financial manipulation stretching back years. Charitable donations diverted, property deals that benefited select members of the parish council, and most disturbing, a coordinated effort to discredit anyone who might expose the truth. Sarah's name appeared repeatedly in recent communications, marked as a priority concern. But before Crawford could act on this information, Bishop Anderson arrived for an unscheduled visit. His face bore the weight of difficult news. "There have been complaints, Michael," he began, not meeting Crawford's eyes. "Serious concerns about your handling of the situation. Perhaps some time away for reflection would be beneficial." Crawford recognized the diplomatic language of removal. As he looked at the bishop, he saw not authority but exhaustion, a man caught in machinations he either couldn't or wouldn't control. "And if I refuse?" Crawford asked quietly. The bishop's response was cut short by commotion outside. Sarah Bennett stood on the church steps, surrounded by supporters, speaking to a news crew. Her voice, clear and unwavering, carried through the open window. "The real miracle isn't what happened to the crucifix. It's how this event has exposed what was hidden in our midst." Parker appeared almost instantly, his usual smooth demeanor showing cracks of anger. The confrontation that followed would be remembered by all who witnessed it, though accounts would differ on who said what. But everyone agreed on one detail. When Parker moved to physically remove Sarah from the steps, Thomas Chin stepped forward, phone recording steadily, capturing everything. As Crawford watched from his office window, he realized they had crossed a point of no return. The question was no longer about preserving peace, but about what kind of peace was worth preserving. The files on his desk offered ammunition, but using them would shake the foundations of faith for many. The cost of truth was becoming clear, and its price would be paid in shattered illusions. The confrontation on the church steps escalated into a full-blown power struggle that engulfed St. Gabriel's. Father Parker, his mask of benevolence slipping, moved swiftly to consolidate his position. Emergency parish council meetings were called, conveniently scheduled when Crawford's supporters were at work. Emily Walker's influence grew as she orchestrated a campaign of whispered doubts about Crawford's stability. Bishop Anderson found himself increasingly isolated, his authority undermined by Parker's direct line to the archbishop. The elderly bishop watched helplessly as decades of carefully maintained relationships crumbled. During a private dinner, he confided to Crawford, "The church has always balanced between heaven and earth, Michael. But lately I fear we've lost sight of which way is up." Sarah Bennett discovered her office had been ransacked, though nothing appeared missing. The next day, anonymous posts appeared on local social media, suggesting impropriety in her relationship with Crawford. The allegations were vague but damaging, designed to cast shadows rather than make specific claims. Her youth group parents received emails questioning her fitness to work with children. Crawford's support eroded strategically. Longtime parishioners found themselves excluded from committees, their donations politely declined. The soup kitchen's supplies mysteriously dwindled, while Parker's new community outreach program received abundant funding. Each move was subtle, technically legitimate, yet part of a larger pattern of isolation and control. Rachel Martinez maintained her quiet resistance, documenting everything while appearing to comply with Parker's increasingly demanding oversight. Her desk was moved to the parish hall, away from sensitive conversations, but her network of relationships built over 20 years proved harder to relocate. Thomas Chin's video of the confrontation disappeared from social media platforms. Flagged for community guidelines violations when he tried to upload it elsewhere, his business received health code violation notices. The message was clear: power had chosen its side. The crucifix itself remained untouched, now hidden behind scaffolding and tarps. Engineering reports appeared, filled with technical language about stress fractures and metal fatigue. Parker ensured these reports received prominent coverage. though the engineers themselves remained unavailable for questions. Crawford found his homilies being recorded, every word analyzed for hints of dissent. His confessional schedule was altered, his most loyal penitents redirected to other priests. Even his mail was accidentally misrouted, forcing him to maintain communication through channels Parker couldn't monitor. Through it all, the divide in the congregation deepened. Sunday masses became exercises in careful observation: who sat where, who spoke to whom, who avoided eye contact. The wealthy north side of town largely aligned with Parker, while the working-class South remained loyal to Crawford, though their voices carried less institutional weight. But resistance persisted in unexpected ways. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer group grew, meeting in homes and coffee shops, sharing information under the guise of devotion. Thomas Chen's hardware store became an unofficial headquarters for Crawford supporters. Messages passed through purchases of nails and light bulbs. Sarah, despite the smear campaign, refused to back down. Her social work colleagues rallied around her, providing professional validation that helped counter the whispers. Local teachers spoke up about her positive influence on their students, creating a counter-narrative to Parker's carefully crafted doubts. The turning point came during a rare joint appearance by Crawford and Parker at a diocesan function. As Parker delivered a polished speech about unity and progress, Crawford quietly circulated among the crowd, his presence a reminder of unresolved questions. The contrast between Parker's smooth rhetoric and Crawford's simple dignity didn't go unnoticed. Bishop Anderson, watching from the sidelines, finally saw the pattern clearly. After the event, he requested a private meeting with Crawford, his words careful but significant. Sometimes, Michael, the greatest test of faith isn't in believing in miracles, but in recognizing the human hand that tries to control them. The investigation into St. Gabriel's finances revealed a web of corruption more intricate than Crawford had initially suspected. Late one night, poring over documents with Rachel Martinez, they uncovered a pattern of systematic theft disguised as charitable initiatives. Parker had created a network of shell charities, each supposedly supporting community outreach but actually funneling money into private accounts. Emily Walker's role proved particularly devastating. The wealthy widow hadn't just been manipulated, she'd been an active participant, using her husband's foundation to launder church funds while receiving tax benefits and social acclaim. The discovery hit Crawford hard. He'd baptized her grandchildren, counseled her through her husband's death, never suspecting her involvement in Parker's schemes. Sarah Bennett's investigation into her own past revealed another layer of complexity. The fire that killed her parents hadn't been the accident officially reported. Insurance documents suggested possible arson. With the investigation mysteriously abandoned after intervention from church officials, the same officials now allied with Parker, the revelation shook her faith but strengthened her resolve to expose the truth. The poor of the parish suffered most visibly. The soup kitchen supplies continued to dwindle while donation records showed increasing contributions. Medical assistance funds disappeared into administrative costs, forcing elderly parishioners to choose between medicine and food. Each discovery added to Crawford's burden of knowledge and responsibility. Thomas Chen's son, a cybersecurity expert, managed to recover deleted emails revealing Parker's coordination with certain media outlets. The coverage wasn't just biased, it was orchestrated, with reporters receiving privileged information in exchange for controlling the narrative. The miracle story had become a smokescreen for deeper corruption. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer group became an unexpected intelligence network. The elderly women, dismissed as harmless by Parker's allies, gathered crucial information during their seemingly innocent visits and social calls. They discovered that Parker had been systematically removing older parish records, particularly those concerning property transactions and charitable bequests. Rachel Martinez's careful documentation proved invaluable. Her years of quietly observing office politics had given her insight into the power dynamics at play. She identified key players in Parker's network: attorneys who handled questionable transactions, contractors who overcharged for repairs, officials who expedited permits without proper review. The engineering reports about the Crucifix raised more questions than they answered. Crawford found evidence that the original inspection had been rushed and superficial, its conclusions predetermined. The engineer's signatures appeared on multiple versions of the report, with key details altered between drafts. Bishop Anderson's position grew more precarious as he began his own discreet investigation. Anonymous threats arrived at his residence, their contents suggesting surveillance of his daily activities. His attempts to contact the Archbishop were intercepted, his messages altered or delayed. The isolation of his position became increasingly apparent. Crawford's legal background proved crucial as he pieced together the evidence. The pattern stretched back years, suggesting Parker's appointment to St. Gabriel's had been purposeful, part of a larger scheme to exploit wealthy parishes. The miracle, rather than initiating the corruption, had simply forced it into the open. Sarah's youth group, despite reduced resources, became a focal point of resistance. The teenagers, with their natural skepticism of authority, started asking questions adults feared to voice. Their social media savvy helped counter the official narrative, though they faced increasing pressure from parents aligned with Parker. Emily Walker's daughter, Catherine, emerged as an unexpected ally. Troubled by changes in her mother's behavior, she began sharing information about private meetings and document transfers. Her position in Millbrook's social circle provided access to conversations that would otherwise remain hidden. The physical toll of the investigation showed on all involved. Crawford's silver hair whitened further, his face lined with the weight of betrayal. Sarah's usual vibrancy dimmed, though her determination burned brighter. Rachel worked late into the night, organizing evidence while maintaining her cover of compliance. As autumn deepened into winter, the scaffolding around the crucifix stood like a skeleton in the church, a visible reminder of unresolved questions. Parishioners whispered that on quiet nights the sound of creaking wood could still be heard from within the covered sanctuary, as if the corpus continued its struggle to break free. The weight of revelations transformed each person touched by the growing scandal. Father Crawford, once known for his measured diplomacy, developed a steely resolve that surprised even his closest allies. His sermons, still delivered in the parish hall, took on a prophetic quality, speaking of justice and truth without directly addressing the controversy. Parishioners noted how his hands, once uncertain during elevation of the host, now moved with deliberate purpose, as if each sacred gesture was an act of defiance. Sarah Bennett's evolution proved most dramatic. The trauma of discovering her parents' death might have been orchestrated shook her to her core, yet somehow strengthened her faith. She began speaking at local churches, her testimony weaving together personal loss and present corruption into a powerful narrative of redemption. Her quiet devotion transformed into a fierce advocacy that drew both admiration and concern from those who knew her. Bishop Anderson underwent his own transformation, though more subtly. His traditional rigidity softened as he witnessed the human cost of institutional blindness. During private masses, aides noticed him spending longer in contemplation, wrestling with decisions that once would have been automatic. His interactions with Crawford, once formal and distant, developed a paternal quality tinged with regret. Father Parker's carefully constructed facade began showing cracks. His smooth charm took on a brittle quality, his responses to questioning becoming increasingly defensive. During public appearances, observers noted moments when his mask slipped, revealing flashes of rage quickly suppressed. His sermons focused increasingly on obedience and authority, betraying his growing anxiety about maintaining control. Emily Walker's position in Millbrook society became increasingly precarious as rumors of her involvement spread. Her usual confidence wavered, her social appearances grew rare, and her charitable works took on a desperate quality, as if trying to buy back respectability. Her daughter Catherine's decision to align with Crawford created a visible rift, their Sunday pew now separated by empty spaces that spoke volumes. Rachel Martinez emerged from her self-imposed background role, her quiet efficiency evolving into strategic resistance. She developed a network of parish staff across the diocese, sharing information under the guise of administrative cooperation. Her detailed knowledge of church politics, accumulated over years of careful observation, proved invaluable in anticipating Parker's moves. Thomas Chen's role transformed from simple hardware store owner to central figure in the resistance. His shop became a safe haven for sharing information, his practical wisdom helping guide strategy. His son's technical expertise combined with his own street smarts created a formidable team that Parker's allies couldn't easily dismiss. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer group evolved from a circle of elderly devotees into a sophisticated intelligence network. These women, who had witnessed decades of parish history, proved remarkably adept at gathering information through seemingly innocent conversations. Their age and perceived harmlessness became their greatest asset. Catherine Walker's journey from privileged daughter to whistleblower marked one of the most profound transformations. Her growing awareness of her mother's complicity forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her family's wealth and position. Her decision to support Crawford cost her socially but gained her a deeper understanding of integrity. The youth group members matured rapidly in the face of crisis. Their initial excitement at uncovering corruption gave way to a more nuanced understanding of moral complexity. They learned to question authority while maintaining respect, to seek truth while acknowledging human fallibility. The congregation itself underwent a collective evolution. Initial divisions based on social class and allegiance began to blur as evidence mounted. Some of Parker's strongest supporters quietly switched sides, while others doubled down on their support, revealing character more than conviction. Even the church building seemed to change, its familiar spaces taking on new significance. The empty sanctuary, still shrouded in scaffolding, became a symbol of institutional corruption hiding sacred truth. The parish hall, temporary home to congregational worship, developed an intimacy that the grander space had sometimes lacked. These transformations created new alliances and unexpected rifts. Former adversaries found common cause, while old friendships fractured under the strain of divided loyalties. The community's fabric rewove itself around truth rather than social position, creating patterns that would have been unthinkable months before. The confrontation erupted during midnight mass on Christmas Eve, a night when even Parker couldn't deny the congregation access to the main sanctuary. The scaffolding remained, but the tarps had been partially removed, revealing the controversial crucifix looming above the altar. The church was packed, social divisions temporarily forgotten in the familiar comfort of tradition. Father Crawford had just begun his homily when Emily Walker stood abruptly, her voice cutting through the sacred atmosphere. "This man," she declared, pointing a trembling finger, "is destroying our church with his lies." Her words echoed off the ancient stones, shocking the congregation into silence. Behind her, Parker emerged from the shadows, a document folder clutched in his hands. "Father Crawford," Parker announced with practiced solemnity, "I have here evidence of serious financial misconduct under your administration." He began reading allegations: misappropriated funds, unauthorized access to restricted accounts, manipulation of charitable distributions. Each charge seemed carefully crafted to mirror his own crimes, a calculated attempt to redirect suspicion. Sarah Bennett rose next, her voice steady despite the tension. "Mrs. Walker, perhaps you'd like to explain the transfers from your foundation's accounts." She held up her own stack of papers, printed copies of transaction records Rachel had quietly compiled. "Or shall I detail them for everyone present?" The congregation erupted in murmurs and gasps. Catherine Walker, seated apart from her mother, buried her face in her hands. Bishop Anderson, present for the holiday service, gripped his crosier tightly, his face a mask of contained fury. Parker moved to silence Sarah, but Thomas Chen and his son stepped forward, phones raised. "Everything is being recorded," Chen announced calmly, "including the evidence we've gathered over the past months." The live-streamed counter on their devices ticked upward as online viewers multiplied. Emily Walker's composure cracked. "You don't understand," she cried, her carefully maintained facade crumbling. "We were building something greater. The old ways are dying. We needed resources to modernize, to survive." Her words revealed more than she intended, hinting at larger plans beyond simple theft. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer group, strategically positioned throughout the church, began sharing copies of documents, evidence of the real financial manipulation, testimony from affected parishioners, proof of Parker's orchestrated media campaign. The papers passed from hand to hand, impossible to suppress. Rachel Martinez chose this moment to step forward, her years of quiet observation giving weight to her words. She methodically outlined the pattern of corruption, dates and amounts flowing from her memory with damning precision. Her testimony, delivered in her usual efficient manner, struck harder than any emotional appeal. Parker's response turned desperate. He attempted to have the police remove Crawford and Sarah for disturbing the peace, but officers present, many with long family ties to St. Gabriel, stood firm. "This seems like a church matter," their sergeant observed quietly. best resolved by the congregation. The confrontation shifted as more voices joined the chorus. Elderly parishioners spoke of denied medical assistance while church funds funded Parker's luxury car. Parents described youth program cuts while administrative salaries soared. Each testimony added weight to the growing evidence. Bishop Anderson finally rose, his authority emanating not from his office but from decades of faithful service. "Enough," he commanded. The single word brought silence. "Father Parker, Mrs. Walker, the Archbishop will hear of this. But first you will hear your own actions described by those you've harmed." The Christmas Eve service transformed into something ancient and powerful, a community confronting corruption in its midst, truth spoken in the face of power. The crucifix above, partially visible through the scaffolding, seemed to watch the proceedings with its eternal, suffering gaze. The confrontation's aftermath brought chaos as Parker played his final desperate cards. Police arrived in force, responding to his claims of riot and endangerment. The midnight mass congregation spilled onto the church steps, their Christmas Eve prayers replaced by shouts and protests. News vans materialized like vultures, their lights casting harsh shadows across the Gothic facade. Parker somehow produced an emergency diocesan order suspending Crawford. The document's authenticity is questionable as its timing. For the safety of all, he declared to the cameras, Father Crawford must step down immediately. His voice carried the practiced concern that had fooled so many for so long, but now rang hollow against the night air. Sarah Bennett, still clutching her evidence, found herself physically blocked from the church by Parker's private security men, whose presence raised questions about church funds' true destination. When she attempted to speak to reporters, her microphone mysteriously failed. The media, long manipulated by Parker's network, seemed eager to paint the scene as a tragic breakdown of order rather than an exposure of truth. Bishop Anderson suffered what appeared to be a heart attack amid the chaos, though doctors would later confirm it as severe anxiety. His collapse, captured by news cameras, shifted public perception dramatically. The sight of the elderly bishop being rushed to an ambulance while Parker continued his media campaign struck many as emblematic of the true crisis at hand. Inside the church, Rachel Martinez and Thomas Chin worked frantically to secure evidence as Parker's allies attempted to access church offices. The sound of shredders ran continuously from the administrative wing, while encrypted files mysteriously began deleting themselves from church computers. Chin's son fought a digital battle against what appeared to be professional hackers, his cybersecurity skills tested to their limits. Emily Walker, seeing the tide turn, attempted to salvage her reputation through a public confession that admitted minor indiscretions while painting herself as Parker's victim. Her daughter Catherine, unable to bear the deception, interrupted with detailed accounts of her mother's willing participation, their public split playing out before rolling cameras. The crisis peaked when Parker, growing increasingly erratic, ordered the removal of the controversial crucifix. "This miracle has brought nothing but division," he announced, signaling to workmen who began ascending the scaffolding. The congregation watched in horror as power tools whined against ancient wood. Crawford, until now maintaining a dignified silence, finally stepped forward. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Stop this desecration." The simple command froze everyone in place. Even Parker's hired workers paused, tools suspended in midair. At that precise moment, whether by divine intervention or structural fatigue, the scaffolding began to sway. Metal poles clashed against each other in an otherworldly symphony. The workers scrambled down as the entire structure seemed to shift, pulling away from the wall in impossible ways. In the ensuing panic, Sarah managed to breach the security line, reaching the church's main computer. Her social work colleagues, strategically placed throughout the crowd, created diversions that allowed Thomas Chin's son to extract critical digital evidence. Rachel Martinez's years of backup documentation found its way to trusted journalists who had resisted Parker's influence. The crisis reached its absolute peak when Parker, seeing his control crumble, attempted to destroy church records with gasoline and a lighter. The ancient stones of St. Gabriel's, however, proved less flammable than he hoped. Officers, who had been maintaining crowd control, switched focus, tackling him before real damage could be done. As Christmas Eve ticked into Christmas morning, the scene transformed again. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer group, showing remarkable organization, distributed coffee and snacks to the cold crowd. Their quiet acts of care provided stark contrast to the power plays they'd witnessed. Officers, many now off duty but remaining present, joined in the impromptu communion. The crucifix, still partially visible through the damaged scaffolding, caught the first light of Christmas dawn. Some would later swear they saw it move again, others that it remained still but wept. What was undeniable was the profound silence that fell over the crowd as the sun's rays illuminated the ancient figure. A silence that spoke of endings and beginnings, of truth revealed and faith tested. My dear friends, as we journey through this powerful story of faith, truth, and redemption at St. Gabriel's, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd join our growing community by subscribing. Your support helps us share more meaningful stories that touch hearts and inspire souls. Welcome to our family. The days following Christmas brought a darkness deeper than winter's early dusk to St. Gabriel's. Despite the evidence exposed, Parker's influence proved more extensive than anyone had imagined. Crawford found himself not just suspended but formally charged with interfering in a diocesan investigation. His quarters were sealed, his personal belongings confined to a single suitcase. Sarah Bennett's world collapsed simultaneously. Anonymous accusations emerged about her time in the orphanage, carefully crafted lies that nonetheless required investigation. The youth program was suspended pending review, leaving vulnerable teenagers without their trusted mentor. Her social work license faced scrutiny from a board member connected to Parker's network. The church itself stood empty, declared unsafe after Parker's attempted arson. Yellow police tape crossed the ancient doors like modernist art, while insurance assessors debated responsibility for the scaffold damage. The crucifix, now exposed to winter weather through gaps in the temporary covering, seemed to absorb the community's suffering. Rachel Martinez arrived one morning to find her office computer seized as evidence not of Parker's crimes, but of her alleged unauthorized access to church records. Years of careful documentation disappeared into evidence bags labeled as proof of conspiracy rather than corruption. Her hands shook as she watched them cart away her files, knowing how easily digital records could be altered. Thomas Chin received notice that his store's lease, held by a company secretly controlled by Emily Walker's foundation, would not be renewed. His son, targeted by corporate lawyers, faced accusations of cybercrimes that threatened his career and security. The hardware store, long a haven for truth seekers, began preparing for closure. Bishop Anderson, released from the hospital, found himself invited to take early retirement. His authority stripped by carefully worded diocesan declarations, he could only watch as Parker's allies systematically dismantled decades of community trust. His final attempt to reach the Archbishop was met with diplomatic silence. The congregation splintered further. Wealthy supporters, fearful of their own complicity being exposed, doubled down on supporting Parker's narrative. Working-class families, facing pressure from employers connected to the parish council, stopped attending services entirely. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer group, now labeled Dissidents, was barred from using church facilities. Catherine Walker paid perhaps the highest price for her honesty. Her mother's lawyers moved to contest her inheritance, while family friends openly shunned her at social functions. She found herself essentially homeless, her credit cards canceled, her reputation in tatters among the social circle she'd grown up in. The media narrative, skillfully managed by Parker's remaining allies, painted a story of troublemakers disrupting church unity. Crawford's past legal career was scrutinized for any hint of impropriety, while Sarah's orphan background was subtly used to question her stability. Every act of resistance was reframed as evidence of conspiracy. Crawford, isolated in a small motel on the outskirts of town, faced his darkest night of the soul. His faith, tested beyond measure, offered little comfort as he watched his life's work systematically destroyed. The phone calls and messages of support dwindled as supporters faced their own consequences for standing with him. The miracle itself was officially declared a hoax, a combination of structural failure and mass hysteria. Scientific reports, funded by Parker's network, provided complex explanations that few understood but many accepted out of desire for normalcy. The mystery that had sparked everything was reduced to footnotes and technical appendices. The ripple effects of St. Gabriel's tragedy touched every corner of Millbrook. The soup kitchen, once serving hundreds weekly, closed its doors as funding disappeared into administrative review. Elderly parishioners who relied on church assistance found themselves choosing between medicine and meals. The community's safety net, woven through generations of faith and service, unraveled thread by thread. Crawford's health deteriorated visibly. Years of stress culminated in sleepless nights and skipped meals, his silver hair thinning noticeably. Friends who visited his motel room found him surrounded by scattered papers, endlessly reviewing evidence they could no longer use. His legal training, once a source of confidence, now highlighted the sophisticated nature of Parker's manipulation. Sarah Bennett's resilience finally cracked under sustained pressure. A panic attack during a youth counseling session triggered by another anonymous accusation led to her temporary hospitalization. The teenagers from her program tried to visit but were turned away by hospital staff acting on family instructions, though Sarah had no living relatives. Rachel Martinez faced professional exile. Other parishes, warned about her disloyalty, refused to hire her. 20 years of administrative expertise became worthless against Parker's whisper campaign. She took a job as a night clerk at a convenience store, watching through the window as former colleagues crossed the street to avoid her. Thomas Chin's family business collapse affected dozens of employees. The hardware store's closure left a hole in the community larger than its physical presence. Local contractors who had relied on Chin's fair pricing and credit understanding found themselves at the mercy of corporate suppliers. His son, fighting legal battles, had to sell his house to pay attorney fees. The Sullivan Prayer Group, elderly women who had dedicated decades to the church, found themselves branded as troublemakers. Their names were removed from volunteer lists, their photos taken down from the parish hall. Some reported suspicious cars following them home from their new meeting place in the local diner. Catherine Walker's fall from grace illustrated the price of truth. She took a job waiting tables at a truck stop, her designer clothes replaced by a polyester uniform. Former friends who saw her there shared photos on social media, adding cruel comments about her appropriate new station in life. Her mother's social circle treated her situation as a cautionary tale about family loyalty. Bishop Anderson, watching from enforced retirement, aged years in weeks. His hands trembled too badly to write the letters of support he wanted to send. Diocesan officials suggested he relocate to a retirement facility in another state, away from the community he had served for decades. The church building itself seemed to mourn. Wind through the damaged roof created sounds like weeping. The garden, untended after Chin's maintenance contract was canceled, withered in the winter frost. Even the pigeons that had roosted in the bell tower for generations abandoned their perches. Parish records from generations of baptisms, marriages, and funerals were reorganized by Parker's team, their history altered through careful omission and strategic revision. Families found their generational connections to St. Gabriel's quietly erased or modified to support the new narrative. The Christmas Eve confrontation was officially recorded as a regrettable incident of mass hysteria, with Parker cast as the voice of reason against emotional instability. Those who spoke truth found their words twisted into evidence of mental instability or personal vendetta. The simple faith that had sparked resistance became a weapon used against the faithful. The miracle of the crucifix, once a source of wonder, became a point of shame. Parishioners who had witnessed it now denied their experience, fear of consequences overwhelming their memory of grace. The scaffold's shadow across the altar seemed to represent the darkness that had overcome their collective spirit. The turning point came from an unexpected source. A junior accountant at Emily Walker's Foundation, troubled by irregularities in the books, contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The federal investigation, beyond Parker's sphere of influence, began quietly but moved with methodical precision. Agents interviewed Rachel Martinez at her convenience store job, their presence causing whispers that spread through town. Simultaneously, Thomas Chin's son, despite his legal troubles, had managed to decrypt Parker's private email server. The contents revealed a network of corruption extending far beyond St. Gabriel's, a systematic exploitation of wealthy parishes across multiple dioceses. More disturbing were the emails discussing the handling of witnesses, including detailed surveillance of Crawford and Sarah. The breakthrough accelerated when Catherine Walker discovered her late father's private records, hidden in a safe deposit box with instructions to be opened if anything happened to him. The documents outlined his suspicions about Parker's influence over his wife and the foundation. More importantly, they contained offshore account numbers and transaction records that matched the patterns Rachel had documented. Sarah Bennett, still recovering in the hospital, received an unexpected visitor, a former nun from St. Mary's Home who had kept her own records of financial irregularities during Sarah's childhood. The fire that killed Sarah's parents, it emerged, had connections to insurance fraud orchestrated by the same network now operating at St. Gabriel's. Bishop Anderson, despite his enforced retirement, had spent his isolation making careful notes and connections. His detailed knowledge of diocesan politics and personnel helped federal investigators understand the broader context of Parker's operations. His testimony, given from his retirement facility, provided crucial credibility to the investigation. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer group proved invaluable to investigators. Their years of observing parish life, combined with their detailed prayer journals documenting concerns and conversations, created a timeline that corroborated financial records. Their seemingly innocent presence at social functions had allowed them to witness crucial conversations that participants thought private. The media narrative began to shift as independent journalists, following leads from Thomas Chen's digital evidence, uncovered patterns of intimidation and manipulation. Reports emerged of similar incidents at other churches' miraculous events, followed by financial exploitation and community division. St. Gabriel's story was part of a larger pattern. Crawford's legal background finally proved its worth as he helped federal investigators navigate the complexities of church finance and canon law. From his motel room, now cluttered with case files rather than evidence of guilt, he worked to connect the dots between seemingly unrelated events and transactions. The Crucifix itself played an unexpected role. Engineering firms reviewing the original incident without Parker's influence found their data suggested movement patterns impossible to explain by structural failure alone. Their revised reports, though careful not to claim miracle, definitively rejected the official explanation of mechanical failure. Rachel Martinez's meticulous record-keeping provided the foundation for tracing money flows. Her years of quiet observation had created a documentary trail that even the most sophisticated financial crimes couldn't completely erase. The convenience store's security cameras captured her hours-long interviews with federal agents, creating new whispers in Millbrook. The federal investigation culminated in pre-dawn raids across multiple states. Parker was arrested at his luxury apartment, still in silk pajamas, his carefully maintained facade crumbling before news cameras. Emily Walker surrendered herself, accompanied by her daughter Catherine, a reconciliation born of truth finally outweighing pride. The scope of exposed corruption stunned even the investigators. Millions in charitable donations had been diverted through a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. The network extended into diocesan offices, financial institutions, and local governments. Each revelation brought new indictments, the circle of accountability widening with each passing day. Sarah Bennett's vindication came with the arrest of 2 former church officials connected to her parents' death. The truth set her free in unexpected ways. Her panic attacks subsided as long-buried questions finally found answers. The hospital staff, witnessing her transformation, became yet more witnesses to the power of truth revealed. Crawford's suspension was lifted with a formal apology from the Archbishop himself, who had been kept ignorant of Parker's activities through careful manipulation of information. The documentation of Crawford's resistance, once used against him, became evidence of his integrity. His return to St. Gabriel's was marked by spontaneous gathering of supporters outside his motel. Rachel Martinez found herself appointed as special advisor to the Diocesan Financial Oversight Committee, her years of careful observation recognized as an asset rather than a threat. The convenience store where she had worked during her exile became a symbol of resilience, with parishioners making special trips to thank her for her courage. Thomas Chen's hardware store reopened with community support, local contractors providing free labor to renovate the space. His son's legal troubles evaporated as evidence emerged of Parker's orchestrated campaign against him. The store's reopening celebration became an impromptu Thanksgiving service, with Crawford blessing the new beginning. Bishop Anderson, strength returning with his vindication, chose to remain in Millbrook rather than accept a prestigious retirement posting. His presence during the rebuilding process provided crucial continuity and wisdom. His gentle guidance helped heal divisions that money and power had created. The prayer group ladies emerged as unexpected heroines, their detailed documentation of parish life proving crucial to prosecution cases. Mrs. Sullivan's living room, once a center of resistance, became a gathering place for healing and reconciliation as community members sought to understand their own roles in recent events. Catherine Walker's journey from exile to whistleblower earned her respect beyond her former social circle. She used her restored inheritance to establish a foundation supporting church transparency and accountability, working closely with Sarah Bennett to protect vulnerable congregations from similar exploitation. The Crucifix, finally freed from its scaffolding, bore witness to the community's healing. Engineers monitoring for structural issues reported no further movement, but parishioners noted a sense of peace emanating from the ancient figure that transcended physical explanation. The media narrative completed its reversal, with St. Gabriel's story becoming a testament to the power of persistent faith and courage in the face of corruption. Journalists who had once dismissed claims of miracle now wrote thoughtful pieces about the mystery of faith amid human frailty. St. Gabriel's Church emerged from its trial transformed. The physical restoration of the building paralleled the community's healing, each repaired crack and refreshed paint symbolizing mended relationships and renewed faith. The winter darkness gave way to spring, bringing with it a sense of rebirth that seemed more than merely seasonal. Father Crawford, though offered a prestigious position at the cathedral, chose to remain at St. Gabriel's. His silver hair caught the morning light as he stood at the altar, now speaking to a congregation that filled every pew. His sermons, once carefully measured, found new depth in addressing the complex relationship between faith and human frailty. Sarah Bennett established a support center in the renovated parish hall, combining her social work expertise with spiritual counseling. The youth program flourished under her leadership, its members now including teenagers from across the social spectrum. The tragedy of her parents' death transformed into a source of strength as she helped others navigate their own trials. Rachel Martinez's office became a model of transparent church administration. Her systems for financial oversight were adopted by parishes throughout the diocese, while her open-door policy encouraged questions rather than suspicion. The filing cabinet that once held secret evidence now displayed parish records openly. Thomas Chin expanded his hardware store to include a community center, where his son taught cybersecurity to seniors and teenagers alike. The space that had sheltered truth seekers during the crisis became a gathering place for building literal and metaphorical foundations. His quiet wisdom continued to guide the parish council, now restructured with diverse representation. Bishop Anderson, though officially retired, remained a beloved figure in the community. His presence at services, seated among the congregation rather than at the altar, reminded everyone that authority comes from service rather than position. His gentle humor helped ease the lingering tensions as old wounds healed. The Sullivan Prayer Group expanded to include younger members, creating an intergenerational network of spiritual support. Their meetings, once focused on uncovering corruption, now centered on building community resilience. Mrs. Sullivan herself, though slowed by age, continued to arrange altar flowers with the same devotion that had helped preserve truth. Catherine Walker used her experience to bridge social divides within the congregation. Her foundation's work extended beyond financial oversight to addressing the root causes of parish vulnerability. Her reconciliation with her mother, though tentative, offered hope to other families divided by recent events. The Crucifix, now properly restored, remained an object of quiet wonder. While no further inexplicable movements occurred, its presence carried deeper meaning for those who had witnessed both miracle and human corruption. The figure of Christ, bearing witness to all, seemed to embody both divine mystery and earthly reality. The media's final reports on St. Gabriel's focused not on scandal but on redemption. The story of a community that faced corruption with faith and courage became a template for other parishes confronting similar challenges. The miracle, whether viewed as divine intervention or catalyst for truth, had initiated a profound transformation. 1 year after the Christmas Eve confrontation, St. Gabriel's held a special service of thanksgiving. The congregation, no longer divided by wealth or status, filled the church with a unity that seemed both miracle and hard-won achievement. Father Crawford, standing before his people, spoke not of past corruption but of future hope. Our faith, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the restored sanctuary, is not measured by the absence of trials, but by how we face them together. The crucifix above him caught the morning light, its shadow falling across the altar in what many saw as a protective embrace rather than a burden. Sarah Bennett's youth choir sang with voices that carried both joy and understanding beyond their years. Their song, echoing through the ancient stones, spoke of resilience and renewal. In the congregation, former adversaries sat side by side, their shared experience of truth and reconciliation stronger than old divisions. The final surprise came during the service's conclusion. Bishop Anderson, supported by Rachel Martinez, made his way to the altar. In his hands he carried a leather-bound volume, the first complete historical record of St. Gabriel's crisis and renewal. "Let this stand as testament," he announced, "that faith shines brightest when tested by darkness." Catherine Walker and her mother, seated together for the first time since the confrontation, shared a hymnal and a tentative peace. Emily, her prison sentence suspended due to cooperation, found a different kind of wealth in humble service. Their story of reconciliation became part of the larger narrative of healing. Thomas Chin's grandchildren played in the church garden, now restored to its former glory. The hardware store's bell chimed in harmony with church bells, a Sunday tradition that symbolized the integration of sacred and secular in community life. His son's cybersecurity program became a model for protecting vulnerable institutions while maintaining transparency. Mrs. Sullivan's prayer group had expanded to include participants from all walks of life. Their weekly meetings, now held in the church's restored side chapel, combined traditional devotion with active community engagement. The wisdom of age and the energy of youth created a powerful force for ongoing renewal. The miracle itself remained unexplained, which many came to see as appropriate. The crucifix's movement had initiated change, but human courage and divine grace had seen it through. The mystery remained, but its fruits were evident in transformed lives and restored relationships. As summer light filtered through the restored stained glass, casting rainbow shadows across the congregation, Father Crawford offered a final reflection. "Our greatest miracle," he said, "was not the movement of wood and metal, but the movement of hearts from fear to faith, from division to unity, from corruption to truth." The epilogue to St. Gabriel's story continued to unfold in countless small moments, in reconciled families, in strengthened faith, in restored community. The church stood as it had for generations, its walls now holding new stories of fall and redemption, human frailty and divine grace. The crucifix above the altar remained still, but the movement it had initiated continued in the hearts and lives of all who had witnessed both miracle and restoration. Sarah Bennett's support center expanded to neighboring parishes, while Rachel Martinez trained a new generation in ethical church administration. The lessons of St. Gabriel spread outward in widening circles of influence, touching lives far beyond Millbrook's boundaries. And on quiet mornings when sunlight filled the sanctuary with golden light, some said they could still hear the faint creaking of wood and metal, not a sound of strain or breaking, but a gentle reminder that the divine continues to move in ways both mysterious and transformative, calling humanity to its better nature through trials and tribulations, toward truth and redemption.